The heavy oak door of the Lubyanka building closed behind them with a finality that seemed to seal their fate. Viktor Petrov stood at attention in the dimly lit briefing room, his partner Anna Volkova rigid beside him, as Colonel Dmitry Sokolov spread classified photographs across the mahogany table. The images showed ragged children on American streets, bread lines stretching around city blocks, and hollow-eyed workers emerging from factories. Outside, Moscow's February wind howled against the reinforced windows, but inside, the air hung thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken expectations. Victor's hands remained steady despite his racing pulse, years of training suppressing any visible emotion. Anna's reflection in the window revealed nothing, her face a perfect mask of Soviet discipline. They had been chosen from thousands, groomed for years, and now the moment had arrived. The colonel's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "Comrades, you will witness firsthand the dying convulsions of capitalism, the exploitation of the masses that our ideology predicts must collapse." He tapped a finger on an image showing a crowded tenement building, his expression grave with ideological certainty. Victor memorized every detail of their cover story. John and Mary Peterson, a modest couple from Cleveland, unremarkable and invisible. Anna would work as a secretary, while Victor found employment in manufacturing, both gathering intelligence on America's inevitable social decay. The cyanide capsules felt impossibly small in Victor's palm when the colonel pressed them forward, each one a final escape from torture and betrayal. "Remember," Sokolov continued, his eyes burning with revolutionary fervor, "everything you have learned about the suffering of American workers, their poverty, their oppression under capitalist tyranny." Victor exchanged a brief glance with Anna, finding in her steady gaze the same resolve that anchored his own wavering courage. They had studied American English until they dreamed in foreign grammar, practiced signatures, until their false identities felt more real than their birth names. The mission briefing books sat before them like sacred texts, filled with statistics about American unemployment, homelessness, and inequality. Tomorrow, they would begin the journey that would take them behind enemy lines, into the heart of the empire they had been raised to. Believe was crumbling. Neither could have imagined that the greatest threat to their mission would not come from American counterintelligence, but from the simple, devastating truth they were about to encounter. The train lurched forward from Montreal's Windsor station, its wheels grinding against frozen rails as Victor pressed his forehead against the cold window glass, watching Canada's industrial landscape blur into darkness. Anna sat beside him, her gloved hands folded primly over a worn handbag containing their forged birth certificates, marriage license, and letters from fictional relatives that had been aged with tea and creased by expert hands in Moscow's forgery department. The other passengers read newspapers or dozed fitfully, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that two Soviet intelligence operatives sat among them like wolves in sheep's wool. Victor's new American passport felt foreign in his jacket pocket, its weight a constant reminder that his real identity now existed only in a locked file cabinet. 5,000 miles away, the heating system rattled and hissed, filling the compartment with stale warmth that smelled of coal smoke and tired humanity. Anna caught his eye briefly, and in that fleeting connection, he saw the same tightly controlled fear that coursed through his own veins like ice water. The border crossing at midnight came with agonizing slowness, each second stretching into eternity as the customs inspector's flashlight beam swept through their compartment. Victor forced himself to breathe normally, to smile with the bland pleasantness of a Cleveland insurance clerk returning home from a Canadian vacation, while his heart hammered against his ribs like a prisoner. Against cell bars, the inspector's face remained professionally neutral as he examined their documents, his eyes scanning the carefully constructed lies that represented months of preparation by the KGB's technical services. "Welcome home, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson," the man finally drawled, his accent carrying that peculiar American informality. that no amount of language training could perfectly replicate. Anna thanked him with her rehearsed Midwestern intonation, her performance flawless despite the cyanide capsule concealed in the hollow of her wedding ring. The train jolted forward again, crossing an invisible line that separated two worlds, two ideologies, two versions of human destiny. Dawn broke over upstate New York like a revelation Victor had not prepared for, painting endless farmland in shades of gold and amber that seemed impossibly vibrant after Moscow's grey February mornings. The houses they passed stood separate and proud, each family apparently possessing their own structure, their own land, a concept so foreign it initially registered as propaganda or elaborate deception. Victor counted automobiles parked in driveways, not collective vehicles, but private machines owned by individual farmers and workers, their chrome catching the early light like promises of mobility and freedom. Anna had abandoned all pretense of sleep, staring out her own window, with an expression carefully controlled but subtly troubled. A young boy on a bicycle waved at the passing train, his casual gesture speaking to a life lived without the constant weight of state surveillance and ideological suspicion. Neither agent spoke, but in their shared silence resided the first hairline crack in their lifelong indoctrination. The America they had been trained to document and exploit was already proving to be something entirely different than the America they had been promised to find. The Bell's supermarket on Delaware Avenue stood like a temple to abundance, its plate glass windows revealing pyramids of oranges and grapefruit that seemed to glow under fluorescent lights with an otherworldly luminescence. Victor hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware that this mundane errand, purchasing food for their modest apartment, had transformed into something far more dangerous than any border crossing. Anna squeezed his arm gently, her touch communicating the necessity of continuing their performance. Even as her own breathing had become shallow and uncertain, they pushed through the glass doors into a cornucopia that assaulted every sense simultaneously. The gleam of endless chrome shelving, the kaleidoscope of colorful packaging, the mingled scents of fresh bread and coffee and produce that spoke of choices beyond anything their training had suggested possible. An elderly woman pushed past them with her metal cart, muttering about the price of butter with the casual dissatisfaction of someone who had never known genuine scarcity. Victor's hands trembled slightly as he gripped a shopping basket, his mind struggling to reconcile this reality with a decade of ideological education about capitalist deprivation. The meat counter stretched for what seemed like impossible distances, offering cuts of beef and pork and chicken in quantities that would feed a Moscow communal apartment for weeks. Yet here, individual shoppers selected portions with barely a glance at price tags. Anna stood frozen before a display of tropical fruits, bananas, pineapples, exotic items she'd only seen in photographs during intelligence briefings about bourgeois excess, now available to ordinary workers in a mid-sized industrial city. A young mother, in a simple cotton dress, loaded her cart with provisions while simultaneously managing two small children, her demeanor suggesting this. Abundance was so routine as to be almost boring. Victor moved mechanically down an aisle containing nothing but breakfast cereals, counting 20, 30, 40 different varieties in boxes decorated with cartoon animals and bold promises, each one representing consumer choice that transformed the simple act of eating into an expression of individual preference rather than state allocation. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with electrical reliability that Moscow could only achieve in the most privileged neighborhoods. He reached for a can of coffee, turning it slowly in his hands while reading the label that advertised something called a money-back guarantee, a concept that assumed merchant accountability to customers rather than the reverse. The checkout line provided no respite from their cognitive crisis, as Victor watched the young cashier, clearly working class, probably not yet 20 years old, operate an electric register while wearing lipstick and a wristwatch that appeared genuine rather than decorative. The Total came to more than he expected, but less than such abundance should logically cost. The numbers on the receipt, representing a fraction of his operational funds, yet purchasing more variety than a Soviet engineer's monthly ration coupons could access. Anna carried one of the paper bags as they walked back toward their automobile, her silence heavy with unspoken questions that neither could voice in public or perhaps even in private. Behind them, the supermarket continued its daily rhythm, ordinary Americans performing ordinary tasks within an economic reality that had just shattered two carefully constructed worldviews. The brown paper bag in Victor's arms felt impossibly heavy, weighted not with groceries, but with the terrible burden of truth that could never be unlearned or safely shared. The Starlight Motor Lodge squatted along Route 20 like a modest promise of rest, its neon sign flickering pink and blue against the deepening evening sky as Victor pulled their rented Chevrolet into the gravel lot. Anna retrieved their single suitcase from the trunk while he approached the registration desk, where a balding man in shirt sleeves barely looked up from his magazine before sliding a key attached to a green plastic diamond across the scarred wooden counter. The room cost less than what Victor had been told to expect for proletarian accommodation in capitalist America, yet when they climbed the exterior stairs and unlocked door number 14, they discovered a private space that fundamentally challenged every conception of working-class existence they had carried across the Atlantic. The room contained 2 double beds with matching floral bedspreads, a wooden dresser with a mirror, 2 upholstered chairs, and most impossibly, a private bathroom visible through an open doorway, its white porcelain fixtures gleaming under a single bulb like symbols of a prosperity that supposedly existed only for the exploiting classes. Victor sat heavily on the nearest bed, while Anna moved to the bathroom doorway, her fingers tracing the chrome fixtures with something approaching reverence or perhaps horror at their implications. In Moscow, she shared a communal toilet with 11 other families, waiting in morning queues while clutching her washing items and trying to maintain dignity in circumstances designed to eliminate it. Here in this unremarkable roadside establishment, hot water flowed instantly from both taps, the pressure strong and reliable, steam rising to fog a mirror that would have been considered a luxury item in any apartment she had known. "This is for workers who drive trucks," she whispered, more to herself than to Victor, her voice carrying the weight of a realization that could not be reversed or forgotten. The man at the desk didn't ask our profession, or check our labor credentials, or assign us based on social contribution. Victor rose and switched on the television set that occupied one corner, its screen blooming to life with casual electricity, showing advertisements for household appliances and automobiles, each product presented as accessible to ordinary citizens rather than rewards for political loyalty. The room's modest wallpaper and simple furnishings somehow screamed louder than any propaganda poster, their very ordinariness testifying to a baseline standard of living that exceeded what Soviet achievement medals and loyalty certificates could access. Victor opened the drawer of the bedside table and discovered a telephone directory, a notepad, and a pen, all provided freely for temporary guests in this bottom-tier accommodation. Anna sat on the opposite bed, her hands folded in her lap, with the rigid posture of someone trying to maintain composure while their understanding of reality underwent structural collapse. "We should unpack," Victor said finally, his voice hollow, gesturing toward their single shared suitcase that contained everything they owned in this identity, this country, this overwhelming new world that refused to match the darkness they had been trained to document. The television murmured on, showing a program where families laughed in bright living rooms, their problems resolved in 30 minutes, their abundance treated as unremarkable background rather than impossible aspiration. Neither agent moved to unpack, both sitting on their separate beds in this private room with its private bathroom and its casual electricity, carrying the terrible weight of witnesses to a truth that could never be safely reported, understood, or reconciled with everything they had believed about history's inevitable direction. The assignment came through their dead drop on the third morning, a typewritten address in the suburb of Kenmore, with instructions for Anna to conduct residential reconnaissance while posing as a visiting cousin interested in local real estate. She borrowed the Chevrolet while Victor remained at the motel monitoring radio frequencies, and she drove north through streets lined with oak trees whose autumn leaves created tunnels of gold and crimson that seemed designed by some theatrical department rather than nature's indifferent hand. The neighborhood materialized like a film, set constructed to mock Soviet achievement, each house standing separately on its own plot of land, separated by strips of manicured grass that served no agricultural purpose but existed purely as aesthetic buffer between private domains. Anna parked 2 blocks from the target address and walked slowly along sidewalks where children rode bicycles, without supervision, and women pushed strollers past flower beds that bloomed with deliberate beauty, and every single residence possessed at least one automobile in its driveway, some families displaying 2 or even 3 vehicles as casually as Moscow families might own extra pairs of shoes. The houses themselves defied every briefing document she had memorized about capitalist concentration of wealth, their modest single-story construction, nonetheless offering separate bedrooms, private yards, and attached garages to families who appeared neither politically connected nor members of any exploiting class. A woman watering her lawn noticed Anna's hesitation and smiled with the reflexive friendliness that Americans seem to deploy without calculation, asking if she needed directions to somewhere, her tone suggesting that strangers warranting suspicion rather than assistance was simply inconceivable in this peculiar country. Anna invented questions about the neighborhood while mentally cataloguing details that contradicted her. Entire framework of historical materialism, the absence of communal facilities, the lack of visible poverty, the overwhelming impression that these ordinary workers lived in conditions superior to high-ranking Soviet officials who had spent decades demonstrating ideological correctness. Walking back toward the parked Chevrolet, Anna passed a driveway where a man in work clothes repaired a lawnmower, while a radio played music from his open garage, tools hanging on pegboards in organized abundance, his weekend devoted to maintaining property that belonged to him alone rather than the collective. She thought of her mother's apartment in Leningrad, 3 families sharing 4 rooms and a single cold water tap, waiting lists for basic furniture stretching years into the future, and the constant cold that no amount of loyalty to the party could warm. The cognitive dissonance created a physical sensation like vertigo, the neat suburban street tilting beneath her feet as she gripped the car door handle and steadied herself against the chrome that reflected her face back at her, showing a woman who had crossed an ocean to document misery, but instead discovered a comfortable mediocrity that demolished everything she thought she understood about justice, progress, and the inevitable future. The drive back to the motel stretched longer than the distance justified, Anna taking random turns through similar neighborhoods, each street offering variations on the same impossible theme of private abundance distributed among people whose labor seemed to purchase not mere survival, but actual dignity, choice, and space. The rendezvous occurred at midnight in a parking lot behind a closed Woolworths department store. Victor, watching the rearview mirror until the Buick appeared precisely on schedule, its headlights flashing twice before extinguishing completely. Grigory Sokolov emerged from the darkness like a shadow achieving temporary substance, sliding into their back seat with the economy of movement that identified career intelligence operatives across all borders and ideologies. He smelled of American cigarettes and cheap cologne, his suit cut in the looser style favored here, but his eyes retained that particular wariness cultivated by decades navigating Stalin's purges and Beria's paranoia, the survival instinct of men who understood that today's handler becomes tomorrow's suspect without warning or logic. Victor began his report with careful neutrality, describing the supermarkets and suburban homes in the clinical language of operational observation. But Grigory's expression hardened before the second sentence concluded. The handler interrupted with a harsh whisper that carried the authority of Moscow Center behind every syllable, insisting that surface prosperity masked deeper contradictions, that American abundance existed only for the privileged classes while millions suffered in invisible poverty that capitalist propaganda carefully concealed from foreign observers. He reminded them their mission focused on documenting racial oppression and labor exploitation, not cataloging consumer goods like tourists, distracted by circus performances designed specifically to deceive exactly such observers. Anna attempted to interject with questions about the ordinary neighborhoods and working families, but Grigory dismissed her observations as contamination by enemy psychological operations, warning that Americanomania represented a documented weakness among field operatives who lacked sufficient ideological preparation. He produced a manila envelope containing newspaper clippings about southern segregation and urban slums, physical evidence of the suffering they were assigned to investigate, rather than being distracted by the theatrical abundance displayed in carefully selected locations. The handler's certainty admitted no contradiction. His worldview protected by layers of interpretation that transformed every observation into confirmation of predetermined conclusions. And Victor recognized that expression from his own face, reflected in countless mirrors throughout his entire life. The meeting concluded with revised instructions and warnings about maintaining proper revolutionary consciousness. Grigory disappearing back into his Buick and leaving Victor and Anna sitting in darkness and silence. Neither spoke during the drive back to the motel, both understanding they had just witnessed something more disturbing than any American prosperity, the impenetrable armor of ideology defending itself against the infection of observable reality, the terrible recognition that truth possessed no authority against belief. The Union Hall occupied a converted warehouse on Buffalo's east side, its brick walls still bearing faded advertisements for agricultural equipment from before the war. And Victor entered through the side door, carrying a notepad and the careful anonymity of a factory worker seeking information about membership benefits. Inside, perhaps 40 men gathered on folding chairs beneath fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical consistency unknown in Soviet facilities, their faces reflecting the ethnic diversity Grigory wanted documented as evidence of exploited masses. But the atmosphere contradicted everything Victor expected. Instead of conspiratorial whispers and fearful glances, the workers spoke in normal conversational tones, some laughing, others arguing casually about contract negotiations with a freedom that made his trained observer's instinct trigger immediate alerts about the disconnect between theory and visible reality. The meeting began without ceremony, a union steward named Frank reading correspondence from the international office before opening the floor to general discussion. And what followed made Victor's hand freeze above his notepad. A machinist stood and openly criticized the governor's labor policies, using language about elected officials that would guarantee arrest within minutes in Moscow, while others nodded agreement or shouted counter-arguments across the room. Another worker complained bitterly about factory management, naming specific supervisors and their alleged incompetence without lowering his voice or checking the doors for secret police. The discussion continued for nearly an hour, men freely debating political candidates, arguing about union leadership decisions, even questioning whether their own elected steward adequately represented their interests. creating a demonstration of working-class agency that possessed no equivalent in Victor's entire life experience. During the break, Victor accepted bitter coffee from a metal urn and listened to casual conversations that deepened his disorientation. These workers owned automobiles, planned weekend fishing trips, complained about mortgage payments on homes they actually owned, rather than communal apartments assigned by bureaucratic decree. One machinist mentioned his daughter attending college, discussing her education with the casual assumption of possibility that would represent impossible fantasy for equivalent Soviet families. Nobody spoke in coded language or checked surrounding conversations before expressing opinions, their faces reflecting frustration or satisfaction, but never the particular wariness that marked Soviet citizens navigating daily existence under comprehensive surveillance. Victor left before the meeting concluded, walking 3 blocks before trusting himself to light a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly in the October darkness. He had just witnessed the American proletariat exercising freedoms that Soviet propaganda claimed existed only under communist liberation, their open criticism of authority demonstrating security that ideology insisted capitalism could never provide. The observation destabilized something fundamental in his understanding, not with dramatic revelation, but through quiet accumulation of contradictions that ideology could no longer adequately explain, leaving him standing on a street corner in a country that refused to match the descriptions that had shaped his entire purpose. The university campus spread across manicured grounds that reminded Anna of sanitized propaganda films, except the students moving between Gothic stone buildings carried an authenticity no Soviet director could manufacture, their animated conversations and casual laughter creating an atmosphere of intellectual freedom she had been trained to recognize as dangerous Western decadence. Her assignment required infiltrating a political science lecture to document reactionary teaching methods and identify potential recruits among disaffected students. But as she climbed worn marble steps into the humanities building, she felt her operational confidence eroding with each passing observation that refused to align with her ideological preparation. The hallways displayed bulletin boards covered in uncensored announcements, advertising everything from folk music, concerts to meetings of socialist student groups, the casual pluralism suggesting an absence of state control that her training insisted would inevitably produce chaos and social collapse. She slipped into the back of a lecture hall where perhaps 60 students occupied wooden seats facing a grey-haired professor who spoke without notes about comparative government systems, his words flowing with the comfortable authority of someone unafraid of midnight arrests for ideological deviation. What followed made Anna's chest tighten with something between fascination and dread, as the professor openly discussed both capitalist and communist systems, presenting strengths and weaknesses of each. Without the mandatory valorization of Soviet superiority, his analytical framework, treating Marxism as one philosophy among many rather than inevitable historical truth. Students took notes or stared out windows with the bored entitlement of those who had never feared education itself, some actually dozing in afternoon sunlight while others raised hands to challenge the professor's interpretations, using arguments that would constitute anti-Soviet agitation, punishable by years in labor camps. During the break, Anna observed students debating in small clusters, their conversations touching forbidden subjects with stunning casualness. One group discussed religious philosophy, another argued about abstract expressionism in art, while 2 young women compared translations of banned Russian poets whose names Anna knew only from classified reports. A male student approached her with friendly curiosity rather than suspicion, asking if she was new to campus, his open smile reflecting the naive trust of someone who had never lived under comprehensive state surveillance. She manufactured responses about transferring from another college, her practiced English accent holding steady, while her mind catalogued the cognitive dissonance between these privileged students and the imagined oppressed American youth she was supposed to contact and cultivate for future intelligence. Operations. She left campus as shadows lengthened across autumn lawns, carrying books she had purchased from the university store to maintain her cover, their uncensored contents representing freedoms that existed here as unremarkable normality while remaining criminal impossibility in the workers' paradise she was sworn to protect and serve. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in their rented apartment above a hardware store, where Victor sat at the Formica kitchen table, reviewing surveillance notes, while Anna stood at the window, watching neighborhood children play stickball under streetlights that illuminated a prosperity neither could continue denying. The silence between them had grown heavier over recent weeks, weighted with observations they documented in coded reports but could not speak aloud. Each small betrayal of doubt potentially marking them for liquidation if the other remained ideologically pure. Victor finally closed his notebook with hands that trembled slightly, the gesture catching Anna's attention in the window's reflection, and she turned to find her partner's face carrying an expression of such naked anguish that her own carefully maintained composure shattered like thin ice over black water. "We need to talk," Victor whispered in Russian, the words carrying forbidden weight in their mother tongue, his eyes checking the walls as if American. Intelligence might be listening, though what he needed to confess posed greater danger to Moscow than Washington. Anna crossed to the table and sat, her chair scraping linoleum that even in this modest apartment exceeded the quality of flooring in their Moscow headquarters, and they stared at each other with the desperate recognition of drowning swimmers spotting another head above water. "Everything we were told," Victor continued, his voice barely audible, "everything we believed about this place, none of it is true, and you know it too. I can see it in how you write your reports now, choosing words carefully to avoid stating what we actually witness." Anna felt tears forming as she nodded, her throat constricting around responses that once spoken could never be unspoken. The admission representing a betrayal not just of Soviet ideology, but of everything their entire lives had been constructed upon. "My sister lives in a communal apartment with 2 other families sharing one kitchen," Anna said, the words emerging with the momentum of confession after years of suppressed doubt, her mind conjuring images of Katya's cramped existence against the single-family homes surrounding them. "She writes me letters about waiting in lines for basic goods while I walk past stores so full of abundance I have to remind myself not to stare like a peasant at a boyar's feast." Victor reached across the table to grip her hand, the gesture simultaneously offering comfort and seeking it, 2 Soviet operatives holding each other's secrets like live grenades with loosened pins. "If we defect, they arrest our families within hours," he said, voicing the calculation that had haunted both of them through sleepless nights. The iron cage of collective punishment that kept even disillusioned agents obedient. "If we return and report what we truly see, we disappear into basements where confessions are extracted with electrodes and rubber hoses." They sat in their American kitchen as evening became night, 2 people trapped between countries and truths, ultimately deciding to continue their masquerade as loyal Soviet operatives while knowing that part of them had already defected in ways that could never be reversed. The remainder of their mission would be performance rather than conviction. Each coded transmission to Moscow a lie of omission, each surveillance report carefully crafted to document America's problems, while minimizing the uncomfortable prosperity that contradicted everything their sacrifice was supposedly protecting. They would carry this knowledge like radiation poisoning, slowly dying from truths their ideology had no framework to process. Representative of countless other operatives who glimpsed behind the curtain and spent remaining years acting out roles they no longer believed. In the morning, they would resume their covers with professional discipline, but tonight they mourned together for the certainty they had lost and could never recover, two believers confronting a crisis of faith with no confessor who could offer absolution. The months stretched into years as Victor and Anna perfected the art of divided consciousness, their outward performances as dedicated Soviet operatives becoming so polished that even they sometimes forgot where the mask ended and their authentic selves began. Like actors who inhabit roles so completely that original identity becomes theatrical memory, they attended Communist Party meetings for American sympathizers in Greenwich Village basements, diligently photographing attendees and recording conversations, all while knowing the genuine threat to Soviet ideology came not from these marginal radicals, but from the simple fact that grocery store clerks owned Chevrolets and vacation homes. Their reports to Moscow grew increasingly sophisticated in selective observation, documenting racial tensions and labor disputes with meticulous detail, while describing material abundance in clinical terms stripped of emotional impact, presenting America as simultaneously advanced and spiritually bankrupt in ways that confirmed rather than challenged Soviet assumptions. Each transmission represented a careful negotiation between survival and complicity, threading the needle between betraying the truth they had discovered and betraying the country that would execute their families for their awakening. Victor began drinking Canadian whiskey alone in their apartment after Anna fell asleep, the alcohol providing temporary relief from the cognitive dissonance that had become his permanent condition, watching late-night television commercials that casually advertised luxuries most Soviet citizens could not conceptualize, let alone afford. He sometimes drafted honest reports in his mind during these sessions, imagining cables that began with words like, "We have been systematically deceived about fundamental conditions in the United States," before recognizing such honesty as elaborate suicide notes that would be signed in his family's blood rather than his own. Anna developed the habit of walking through department stores during reconnaissance assignments, touching fabrics and examining products with the careful attention of someone committing details to memory, creating mental inventories of abundance she could never explain to her sister in letters that passed through censors. They rarely discussed their shared knowledge anymore, having said everything that could be said during that Thursday confession, instead communicating through significant glances and weighted silences that acknowledged their permanent state of internal exile. The handler who met them quarterly in various safe houses never seemed to notice their transformation, accepting their reports with bureaucratic efficiency while offering ideological encouragement that sounded increasingly hollow to ears that had heard American workers complain about insufficient vacation time rather than insufficient bread. Victor sometimes wondered if other agents experienced similar awakenings, if there existed a silent network of disillusioned operatives throughout American cities, all maintaining their covers while privately questioning everything, a ghost organization of the ideologically dead, continuing to serve the living ideology through sheer institutional momentum. Anna contemplated this parallel system during sleepless nights when her mind replayed images of Moscow communal apartments against American suburban developments, considering whether the Soviet leadership themselves knew the truth and simply could not acknowledge it, without dismantling the entire structure of power that depended on controlled information. They became anthropologists studying their own reaction to forbidden knowledge, observing how human consciousness adapts to irreconcilable contradictions by creating separate compartments where opposing truths never directly confront each other. Years later, when they finally returned to Moscow as decorated operatives who had successfully maintained deep cover throughout hazardous assignments, Victor and Anna carried their American observations like contraband across the border, dangerous cargo concealed not in luggage but in memory where no customs inspection could detect it. They resumed Soviet lives with practiced normalcy, accepting commendations and promotions while privately seeing their homeland through eyes permanently altered by comparison. Forever tourists in the country of their birth, patriots transformed into exiles who had never left. The cognitive burden they carried was shared by thousands of other returned operatives, diplomats, journalists, and trade officials who had witnessed Western prosperity firsthand and returned to maintain the collective fiction that Soviet citizens enjoyed superior conditions under superior systems. Their silence became another form of service to the state, protecting not Soviet strength but Soviet mythology, custodians of dangerous knowledge who understood that some truths were too destabilizing to speak and too persistent to forget, living their remaining years in the strange twilight between belief and betrayal, where most true believers eventually find themselves residing. Have you ever had to keep silent about a truth that changed everything you believed? Subscribe to explore more hidden stories from the shadows of history.